All right, so after this short hiccup, I will continue. So in the following, I will cover four parts. In the introduction, I will discuss Western esotericism in terms of the state of research on theosophy. Then I will highlight some important contexts that support my thesis. And I will then set up a theoretical framework, which I will explain with an example from the Sanatan Textbooks. This will then conclude in a brief consideration of the analytical tool and what I just then presented. So in the research on esotericism, the term Western esotericism, and I will stop doing this because I would have to do this quite a lot. So the term Western esotericism was for a long time the predominant concept used to describe esotericism. Scholars of Western esotericism pointed out that esotericism was typically Western and that esotericism did not exist outside the West. Any overt relations with non-Western traditions were neglected or subsumed into the narrative of Western Orientalism, which appropriated, misunderstood, and most importantly, misrepresented the non-Western tradition. This perspective, informed by Edward Said's Orientalism, allowed scholars to focus on the images of the East that the West constructed for itself. However, the post-Said debate has made clear that such a one-sided constructivist view is blind to multiple processes of interconnectedness and hybridization that take place in the global discourses. One-sided constructivist views not only marginalize the agency of the Orientals, but also simply replace one construction with another. Eventually, they perpetuate Kipling's famous trope, and I quote, "Oh, East is East and West is West, and never the twain shall meet." Although the term Western esotericism has been criticized for some years now, it has had and continues to have a tremendous influence on the study of theosophy. Founded in New York City in 1875, the Theosophical Society at the turn of the centuries had a widespread network of lodges, schools, libraries, and numerous publishing houses that published books, magazines, and even daily newspapers, from England to India to Australia, and from there back over the Philippines to Japan and both Americas, as we heard many examples during this conference. The Theosophical Society had truly grown into a global structure by 1900 at the latest. Annie Besant joined the Theosophical Society in 1891 when she was at the height of her political career in Europe. She was one of the most gifted speakers of her time, and her lectures often drew thousands of people, as we can see here in a lecture from in India, where she's standing in the middle. The public lectures, publishing houses, and journals have been the backbone of the spread of theosophical ideas. Of the main problems in the study of theosophy is certainly not the lack of sources, but rather the overwhelming mass of available sources. Therefore, it is not surprising that scholars writing about theosophy base the pictures on what theosophy was on one or two theosophical publications, mostly on publications by Blavatsky. To this day, there is no history of Theosophical Society that would meet scholarly standards. Likewise, there are almost no scholarly biographies of theosophists, except perhaps of Blavatsky, best in Norcott. My judgment, well, I know, might be too harsh, but one point is indisputable. When primary sources are received, they are usually those of Western theosophists, those of Blavatsky, Besant, Orchard, and Sinnett. This has led to an unbalanced picture of the Theosophical Society. I would like to illustrate this with a photograph taken at the Benares Convention in 1909. Here we see Besant sitting in the middle of a large crowd. She's the only one in this picture we can clearly identify and well, maybe probably George Arundel, and you guys might know some other people in the picture. But by far, the most knowledge we have is about Annie Besant. Such an imbalance in the Theosophists, while the work of some Western Theosophists is by far disproportionate. Well, my work cannot redress this imbalance, but in the following, I try to show a way how this imbalance might be shifted, at least a little. So let me first look at some important contexts. At the center of Annie Besant's Theosophy are considerations of human evolution that are closely interwoven with theosophical ideas about the sevenfold constitution of man and the planes of being. In a nutshell, the gross physical bodies are understood as carriers of the Atma, the true self, which is to be recognized and to which a permanent connection is to be established. Around 1890, the concept of consciousness became increasingly important in the theosophical doctrine of the sevenfold nature of man. Subsequently, the realization of the Atma was described as an expansion of consciousness. In Besant's philosophy, this expansion is equated with initiation. In the path of discipleship, one reads, and I quote, "Initiation means this. It means the expansion of consciousness, which is brought about by the definite intermediation of the guru. It opens up the initiate within his hand, the key which unlocks the door of nature. To what end? In order that he may become more serviceable to the world at large, in order that his power of service may be increased." So this is the first context, initiation and consciousness. The next context I like to introduce is indicated by the phrase mediation of the guru. It is the theosophical narrative of the masters. In theosophy, it is claimed that there are masters or mahatmas who were the guardians of the ancient wisdom religion, as evolutionary advanced human beings who passed on their knowledge to the less evolved humans. Well, and it is potentially possible for all humans to reach the evolutionary level of the masters. Now I'd like to introduce a third context, with the basis of the theosophical conception of evolution is formed by two complementary evolutionary cycles: the common evolution of everything, and especially of mankind as a whole, and the individual evolution. For the general evolution, the masters laid down certain laws and ethics, or in other words, the religions that were most suitable for the present stage of humanity's development. Following the ethics proclaimed in these would benefit the individual evolution. Besant saw humanity as having reached a turning point around 1900. Hinduism was, in her opinion, the religion best suited for the next evolutionary step of mankind. Nevertheless, both the general and the individual evolution are extremely slow, according to the Theosophists. It could take numerous until a human being would reach the level of a master in the normal course of evolution. Thus, there is a gap between the evolutionary status of the Mahatmas and their pedagogical approach. The pedagogical approach to individual evolution leaves individual progress so slow that the goal cannot be reached in the foreseeable future. This was called the master paradox. On the one hand, the theosophical school system can be understood as a transformation of the master-chela relationship into an institutionalized form. And on the other, the acceleration of evolution is described can be read as a response to the master paradox. Through the quickening of evolution, the normal course of evolution is skipped by theosophy. Besant's quickening of evolution and the stages of initiation, she described describes can be understood as a systematization of Blavatsky's The Voice of the Silence. To assume a direct dependence, however, would fall short of the complexity of the discursive field from which Besant's notion of the quickening of evolution emerged. I would like to illustrate this briefly again with the term consciousness. Maninal Dwivedi, a theosophist, Gujarati writer, and an active member of the Gujarati Renaissance, translated Chit as consciousness in his 1885 Raja Yoga. This work seems to be one of the sources for Blavatsky's reception of Raja Yoga as initiatory stages. Interestingly, Dwivedi adopted the stage terminology for his explanation of Raja Yoga in his revised edition in 1890, which may be understood as a reaction to Blavatsky's The Voice of the Silence, which appeared between the first and the second editions of Dwivedi's Raja Yoga. By translating Chit with consciousness, Dwivedi was able to connect Western ideas about consciousness, in particular the expansion of consciousness, with his Vedantic Raja Yoga. And similar ideas about the expansion of consciousness into Brahman were formulated by T. Subarao. Besant undoubtedly knew these writings. Thus, her ideas of the expansion of consciousness and initiation can be understood as hybrid. And I am particularly interested in these kinds of multi-layered hybridization processes. So this brings me to my main argument. So my main thesis is, therefore, that the philosophical doctrine emerged from a diversified global colonial discursive continuum involving numerous South Asian, European, and many other actors. However, there is no such thing as the philosophical doctrine, because whenever we try to pin down such a doctrine in the historical sources, it immediately becomes fluid. This leads us to the second part of this presentation, the theoretical framework. Homi Bhabha argues that every discourse is unstable, and this opens up the potential possibility for every actor to creatively engage in the discourse and realize his or her agency. Bhabha is thus able to argue convincingly for an immanent connection between concepts such as East and West by pointing to their interconnectedness. In this way, he succeeds in making intelligible where colonial agency can be realized. However, his contribution must rather be read as a deconstructive essay, and his concepts are rather non-concepts. Therefore, his theory defies use as an analytical tool. Thus, in order to use hybridity as an analytical term, a tool is needed to describe and analyze hybridization processes more precisely. This requires a language that allows us to A, describe hybridization in a more nuanced way, and B, distinguish different hybridization processes from each other, and C, a language that is sensitive to the context in which these processes take place, and D, allows us to identify and analyze the traces of hybridization at the textual level. In the following, I would like to distinguish between 4 different processes of hybridization, which I will then try to elaborate some more in an example. In the following, I will talk about one. Sorry, that was too fast. Translation actually describes a process of translating an element or a structure into another linguistic system. D and recontextualization focuses on the transfer of elements and structures within the same language system. For example, the term evolution from the popular discourse on evolutionism to theosophy. 3, tradition aims to describe the transfer of elements and structures. Elements and structure means like words, or a structure which means like a framework of evolution, of evolutionary progress or something like this. So it's just elements which would be one word, and the structure which would be a rather complex notion of something. Well, within one community. For example, in the Theosophical Society, We could talk about the masters, which is a good example. At first, they may have been actual historical persons. Then the concept is transferred to various contexts, to Egypt, to Tibet, to the Gobi Desert in Besant's work, and to South Asia with Theosophy, who said that Shankara was a master. In these contexts, the already hybrid concept of the philosophical masters was further hybridized. And then the fourth category, or the fourth process of hybridization, is relationalization. The word is hideous, you can't really say it, but it's still to make relations. And it is a process that is brought about by the intentional act of relating one element or structure to another. At the textual level, these hybridization processes can be traced by means of certain markers, for example, translated or transliterated words. So, turning to the Sanatan textbooks, I would like to illustrate how to apply the tool outlined above. The Sanatan textbooks are part of a complex editing and publishing process that was significantly influenced by Annie Besant and Bhagavan Das. However, numerous other Indian members of and non-members of the Theosophical Society were also involved in the process. Benares was the primary context. Actually, I'm sitting in Benares. Benares was the primary context in which the editorial process took place. The structures in the city, such as the Central Hindu College, the Theosophical Society, and the Board of Trustees, which was the main consortium that would edit the textbooks, allowed for encounters between different actors and allowed for the realization of possible connections, or actually the agency, the colonial agency of these members that were in these structures, that were acting in these structures. So resulting in multiple processes of hybridization that then can be traced in the Sanatana Dharma textbooks. I would like to show you how such processes can be analyzed at the textual level by means of a short extract from the Sanatana Dharma elementary textbook. There we read, the ashramas and the varnas were given in order to show people what kind of virtues they should aim at, in particular in the particular place and time in which they find themselves, and thus to help on their orderly evolution. As all men have not the power nor the time to find out for themselves the will of Ishvara, the Shastras have been given to tell us of that will, and so to help us in distinguishing between right and wrong. In this short extract, several traces of hybridization can be seen. The terms ashrama and varna, as well as Ishvara and Shastra, are to be read as traces of translation. These terms were inserted into the English text in transliterated form. In this way, they were repeated in an altered context. All these terms, meaning ashrama, varna, Ishvara, and Shastra, are already part of different traditions. And this shows, or this highlights, that these terms, which now appear in the Sanatana Dharma textbooks, were already hybrids that were again hybridized. In addition to translation, D and recontextualization can be discerned. On the one hand, the concept of evolution, which is prominently used here, is a paradigmatic example of de- and recontextualization within the philosophical notion of the human progress. Furthermore, will of Ishvara can be read as a trace of the same type. Besant describes submission to the will of Ishvara as an important component of her quickening of evolution. The relationalization can be determined by the expression certain place and time. And now I need a little more time to explain that. This refers to the evolutionary relative position of all people. In the paragraph here, this can be read as an indication that the authors of the text understand these positions and can recognize the current evolutionary stage of the students. They know the Shastras are best suited to understand the will of Ishvara, epistemologically, hierarchically related to all other religions as superior. Based on the philosophical narrative of the master, a further rationalization is made, and this is based on a twofold argument. In the Sanatan textbooks, Manu, and the paragraph quoted here directly refers to the Manusmriti, is described as the creator of the Pitris. The Pitris occupy a prominent position in theosophy because they are understood as beings who came to Earth to accelerate the evolution of humanity. Manu is described as a theosophical master who is genealogically, hierarchically related with other masters. The Sanatana textbooks and their authors are embedded with this statement in the same lineage of masters. Well, we thus see that hybridization is processes of hybridization. Let me conclude. Starting with the notion of the quickening of evolution, I sketched a multifaceted discursive field in which the colonial agency of the South Asian actors became visible. Manilal Trivedi's exposition of his Advaita Vedanta Raja Yoga became the template for the initiatory stages of theosophical evolutionism. Thus, these stages are at the heart, and these stages are at the heart of the theosophical teaching. Initiation into occult knowledge enables the Chela to accelerate his own evolution to the point where his own becoming Ishvara can be realized in his lifetime. This accelerated path is associated with the idea of attaining certain powers called the siddhis. Besant demonstrated these siddhis in her clairvoyant observations of thought forms in occult chemistry. She hence embodied the perfect disciple who was embarked on an exponentially accelerated path to mastery, demonstrated by her example. She could thus demonstrate by her example that the theosophical teaching works and does indeed lead to an accelerated evolution. This initiatory path and the stages formulated therein were transformed at the Central Hindu College into a moral pedagogy for religious instruction, which was intended to make the students philosophical chelas and eventually philosophical masters. The Sanatana Dharma textbooks were used as books for religious instruction at the Benares Hindu University, of which the Central Hindu College became the nucleus. Against this background, the importance of the textbooks can hardly be overestimated. The analysis of the processes described above shows that it's too short-sighted to describe the theosophical society as Western or Eastern. The elaboration of the manifold process stages of initiation manifest themselves as such in Besant's work and then as a moral pedagogy in the Central Hindu College impressively shows that East and West are inseparable and mutually dependent. And this can then be read in more detail in my forthcoming monograph, which I hope will be published in early 22. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yves, for this very fascinating paper on the philosophical movement in India, Annie Besant, specific texts, and your method of and theory of hybridization, and how I think you really show how, I mean, the categories of East and West are very problematic because they are completely fused in the texts you deal with here, and also in the way that people engage with this. So the floor is now open for comments and questions. Please write in the chat or raise your hand if you have a comment or question for Yves. In the meantime, I was thinking, Yves, how you really consider this method or approach of hybridization, because as you showed in your slide, you have certain terms and words that are being kept in Sanskrit, for example, and then And what do you think the selection mechanism is here? Is that because these words and terms, they are considered to contain too much of the original context, the original tradition, that it becomes difficult to translate them? So there's an attempt to maintain some of the original meaning, or do you think it's because, I mean, what is the reason, do you think, the selection mechanism behind that kind of, because there's a lot in translation studies, of course, that speculate whether you want to make a hard translation or softer translation when you
well, I mean, this is a great question, and for Annie Besant, it is quite difficult to answer it. In her earlier translations, well, I know about the Bhagavad Gita. In her earlier translations, she tended to not translate most of the Sanskrit terms, and then she started translating them, and she was criticized for doing it. And then she made some kind of mixture. She had them in Sanskrit, and then she glossed it. But well, in the introduction to her Bhagavad Gita translations, she says it is very difficult to translate those words, and she was very aware that there is no one-to-one translation of these words, and they are embedded in different cultures and different contexts. In this particular extract I showed from the Sanatan textbooks, I think that well, we need to think a little about the audience. The audience are Indians attending, or South Asians attending, the Central Hindu College, and terms like Varna and Shastra, they're quite common. There are quite common words. Even if you don't have a clue about Sanskrit, you might know what a Varna is, or you might have some sense about it. And so it might be easier to not translate it and then fill it when you teach about it. And so that would be my guess why they are not translated here in this particular paragraph. But I don't know about the actual selection processes and what was translated and what was not. And yeah, that would be interesting to do some more research in that direction.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer, Yves. So we are running a bit short on time, also because we had some technical problems. But if there is a final quick question or comment for Yves, then you're welcome. Okay, so let's all give Yves a hand and a reaction on Zoom. Thank you so much for this paper and for being here.
Thank you very much.